The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady rhythm that lulled most passengers into a quiet daze. Some scrolled through their phones, some drifted in and out of sleep, while others flipped absent-mindedly through in-flight magazines. It was an ordinary night flight, the kind that blended into memory. Nothing remarkable about the rows of seats or the narrow aisle stretching toward the cockpit. The atmosphere carried the stillness of routine, the kind of environment where nothing unusual was expected to happen. In seat 12B, a young woman sat silently, blending into the fabric of anonymity, her presence hardly noticed beyond a polite smile when someone passed her in the aisle. She looked like anyone else, a passenger in transit, another face in the crowd. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight climbed higher, cruising through dark skies, and the murmurs of conversation began to fade. To the soldiers seated near the back, she was just another civilian, someone unconnected to the sharp edge of duty they carried. To the businessmen sipping coffee in the front rows, she was another traveler, perhaps heading to a conference or returning home from one. To the crew moving steadily down the aisle, she was a passenger with no special needs, no urgency in her eyes, no sign that she was anything but ordinary. The first hint of change came when the aircraft shuddered, a ripple of turbulence sending trays rattling and drinks spilling onto napkins. Passengers looked up briefly, then relaxed when the shaking settled. It was nothing unusual. Turbulence was part of flying. But soon, the air grew rougher. The plane jolted with a sudden drop, followed by another, sharper lurch that made several people gasp. Overhead bins rattled, and the once quiet cabin shifted into uneasy whispers. Through it all, the young woman in 12B remained calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes steady as if she had weathered storms far worse than this. Still, to those around her, she was only a passenger, quiet, contained, no different from anyone else on board. The intercom crackled once, then went silent. A few passengers glanced upward, expecting the usual reassurance from the flight deck. Instead, the turbulence intensified, trays crashing to the floor as lights flickered briefly overhead. A child began to cry. Panic stirred in waves, and suddenly, the ordinary atmosphere shattered into something else entirely. When the intercom finally came alive, the voice that emerged was firm, commanding, and steady. It was the flight commander, addressing not only the crew but everyone in the cabin. His tone cut through the chaos with clarity. He spoke a name, announcing it in a way that made every head lift and every conversation stop. A name no one had expected, a name that belonged to the quiet woman in 12B. In that instant, the perception of her changed completely. The soldiers in the back straightened, recognizing the weight behind the commander's words. The businessmen who had barely noticed her now stared in disbelief. Even the crying child fell silent as the energy of the cabin shifted. Passengers who had dismissed her as a face among many now realized she was not merely traveling alongside them. She was someone of consequence. Her name carried history, responsibility, and the unmistakable tone of authority when spoken aloud by the commander. What had moments ago seemed like an ordinary flight suddenly became charged with tension, as if the fate of everyone on board now hinged on the presence of the woman whose identity had been revealed. Whispers spread quickly through the rows. Some asked who she was. Others tried to recall if they had read about her before, but most simply stared, trying to reconcile the quiet, unassuming figure with the gravity her name commanded. The shock was universal, a shared moment when anonymity dissolved and the extraordinary was unveiled within the most ordinary of circumstances. The entire cabin, once lulled into routine by the gentle hum of engines, now held its breath, knowing the flight would never again feel like just another night in the sky. The first moments after boarding had been unremarkable. Passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle, dragging carry-ons and searching for seat numbers. The cabin crew smiled with practiced warmth, guiding them along as the overhead bins began to fill. The young woman who slid into her seat did so with quiet precision, placing her small bag beneath the seat in front of her and fastening her belt without drawing attention. She gave no sign of restlessness, no hint that her presence meant anything beyond a routine journey. To those around her, she was a passenger like any other, absorbed in the silent ritual of air travel. The flight lifted into the night sky with the usual sense of detachment, people retreating into their own small worlds. Movies, headphones, sleep. For a long while, nothing disrupted the illusion of normalcy. The steady drone of engines accompanied the clinking of cups, the shuffle of magazines, and the soft conversations that dotted the cabin. The soldiers seated together in the back spoke in low voices, their tone clipped with discipline but relaxed enough to suggest this flight was simply a pause in their larger mission. None of them spared the woman in seat 12B a second glance. The business travelers engrossed in spreadsheets and laptops thought no more of her than they did of the crew walking past. Even the children who peeked at other passengers lost interest quickly, their curiosity fading as soon as she offered a faint, polite smile. When turbulence first struck, it was small enough to be ignored. A shudder, a brief bounce, the kind that reminded passengers they were still at the mercy of the skies. Some tightened their belts, others adjusted their trays, and life moved forward. But the second wave came harder, jolting the aircraft with enough force to scatter drinks and make several people grip their armrests. A ripple of unease passed through the rows, whispers rising as the plane continued to sway against unseen currents. The intercom remained silent at first, as if the crew had not yet decided what to say. The silence made it worse. Faces turned upward, waiting for the familiar calm of a pilot's reassurance. Instead, the shuddering grew harsher, and the quiet became louder. Each second weighted with unspoken fear. A baby's wail cut through the cabin, matched by the nervous laughter of a passenger trying to mask dread. Then, suddenly, the intercom clicked alive. A crisp voice filled the air, firm and deliberate, belonging unmistakably to the flight commander. His words were not the generic reassurances passengers expected. He did not begin with weather reports or turbulence updates. Instead, his tone carried authority, the kind that silenced every whisper instantly. He spoke a single name, clear and deliberate, announcing it with the weight of command. It was the name of the quiet woman in seat 12B, the one who had blended so seamlessly into the background until that moment. The effect was immediate and electrifying. People turned in their seats, necks craning, eyes locking onto her as though seeing her for the very first time. Soldiers in the back stiffened, their discipline kicking in at the recognition of significance. The businessmen froze, caught between disbelief and curiosity, their minds racing to place her identity. Even the crew paused mid-aisle, trays in hand, their expressions betraying surprise at hearing that particular name spoken aloud over the system. Whispers broke out like sparks on dry grass. Who was she? Why had the commander singled her out? Passengers exchanged hurried theories, their voices low but urgent. Some swore they had heard her name before in articles or broadcasts. Others struggled to recall where or how. The air became charged with curiosity, and beneath it, a quiet awe. The ordinary illusion shattered with that single announcement. The woman herself did not flinch. She sat still, her expression unreadable, though a flicker of recognition passed through her eyes. She had expected anonymity on this flight, expected to remain unseen, but the commander's voice had stripped away that cover. Around her, the perception shifted violently. A moment ago, she was invisible, unimportant, a shadow among strangers. Now, every gaze carried weight. Every glance lingered too long, as though the passengers sought evidence of who she truly was in the lines of her face or the calm of her posture. That single announcement transformed the atmosphere of the cabin. Fear, awe, and speculation fused together, binding every passenger in a shared realization. The woman in seat 12B was not simply passing time between destinations. Her identity carried a weight that altered the very balance of the flight, a revelation that left the cabin suspended between confusion and expectation, waiting for what would come next. Gasps echoed through the cabin the moment the commander's voice cut across the intercom. For an instant, the plane seemed to still, as though the engines themselves were holding their breath. The name he spoke hung in the air like an electric charge, crackling across the rows, impossible to ignore. At first, some passengers blinked in confusion, unsure if they had heard correctly. Then recognition began to ripple, like a shockwave spreading seat by seat. Faces turned, expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief, then to something deeper, an unspoken awareness that they were not sharing the cabin with just another traveler. It began in whispers. A soldier in the back leaned closer to his comrade, muttering under his breath, his tone betraying surprise. A mother cradling her child glanced sideways, her eyes wide, her lips pressing tightly, as though trying to remember where she had heard that name before. The businessman in the aisle seat dropped his pen, his work forgotten as he studied the young woman who suddenly carried a new aura. Even those who had been dozing stirred, pulled awake not by turbulence, but by the sudden shift in the atmosphere, their attention drawn like magnets to the quiet figure now at the center of everything. The shock was not loud at first. It was collective, almost synchronized. People looked at her, then at each other, as if needing confirmation that they had all experienced the same revelation. The woman in 12B did not move, her posture unchanged, but her stillness now felt intentional rather than casual. Before the announcement, she had been invisible. After it, every detail about her seemed magnified. The calm set of her jaw, the way her eyes lingered on nothing in particular, even the steady rhythm of her breathing. All of it radiated a kind of control that stood in stark contrast to the panic creeping through the cabin. The disbelief settled into unease. A man in the front row whispered to his seatmate, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. Another passenger leaned out into the aisle, staring openly, as though trying to match the commander's words with the woman's face. Suspicion mingled with awe. What was someone like her doing here, hidden among ordinary passengers? Why had she been silent until now? The questions burned unspoken, yet they weighed on the air like thunderclouds. For some, the revelation brought a strange kind of comfort. Soldiers who moments before had been bracing against turbulence now straightened, their instincts telling them that if her name carried such authority, then perhaps they were not as vulnerable as they had feared. Others felt the opposite, an edge of fear prickling at their nerves. If someone of her stature was aboard, then what danger might they be flying into without even realizing it? Her presence changed the context of everything. The turbulence, the commander's tone, the strange tension creeping through the cabin. Children who had been restless moments earlier grew quiet, their parents pulling them close, whispering reassurances even as their own eyes betrayed uncertainty. Crew members exchanged glances, their training keeping them professional, but their posture betraying the same disbelief spreading among the passengers. It was as though a curtain had been pulled back, revealing that the ordinary journey was anything but ordinary. Disbelief shifted again into speculation. Snatches of conversation drifted through the rows. Some claimed they had read about her in classified briefings leaked to the public. Others swore they had seen her once on a news broadcast, connected to missions no one dared discuss in detail. A few argued quietly, their theories clashing in hurried tones, all of them circling the same reality. The passenger in 12B was far more than she appeared to be. The woman herself remained composed, her silence deepening the mystery. She did not acknowledge the stares, nor respond to the weight of expectation pressing down on her. If she felt the eyes of the entire cabin burning into her, she gave no sign. That quiet control unsettled some, inspired others, and left everyone else suspended in the same shared disbelief that refused to fade. The cabin had transformed in the space of a few words. Where once there had been the dull monotony of routine flight, there now existed an invisible tension, a heightened awareness that bound every passenger together. They were united by shock, tethered to a revelation that refused to be dismissed. The commander's voice had lifted her out of anonymity and placed her squarely in the spotlight, and now disbelief clung to the walls of the cabin like static, refusing to dissipate, leaving the air thick with questions no one dared to voice aloud. The turbulence grew harsher, rattling trays and making the overhead bins shake with each sudden drop. Passengers clutched their armrests, knuckles pale against the dim cabin lights. Some prayed silently. Others muttered reassurances they did not believe, their voices cracking under the pressure of fear. The air grew heavier with every jolt, a tension that no polite smile from a flight attendant could mask. The young woman in 12B sat steady, her composure standing in stark contrast to the panic spreading around her. Where others trembled, she seemed anchored, her posture unshaken, her gaze calm, as though chaos was something she had met before and learned not to fear. The intercom crackled once more, the commander's voice cutting through the noise. His words were precise, clipped with authority, but underneath was the unmistakable tone of urgency. He named her again, calling her not as a passenger, but as someone with purpose. The sound of her name carried across the cabin with the weight of command, and suddenly the situation sharpened into something far more than turbulence. This was no longer a test of patience in the skies. It had become a test of courage, a moment where fear and strength would collide. Panic surged in waves. A woman in the front row clutched her child to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. A businessman muttered frantically about safety protocols, his words tumbling over themselves in nervous repetition. Soldiers near the back exchanged quick, sharp glances, their instincts telling them something larger was unfolding. Whispers turned to worried questions, and the hum of speculation layered itself over the roar of the engines. Through it all, the woman remained composed, her silence more powerful than any reassurances could have been. She did not need to speak to steady those who looked her way. Her presence carried weight. Passengers who moments earlier had been on the brink of panic found themselves glancing at her, as if seeking confirmation that survival was possible. The calm in her eyes, the steadiness in her breathing, the unflinching way she braced against each violent jolt, all of it radiated a kind of courage that contrasted sharply with the fear consuming the cabin. The turbulence reached its peak, throwing cups and napkins to the floor, sending gasps across the rows as the plane pitched downward before steadying again. Some passengers screamed openly, the sound raw and piercing, while others sat frozen, too overwhelmed to react. Yet every time the aircraft rocked, the woman's demeanor stood as a quiet counterpoint. She did not flinch when others did not cry out when trays crashed, did not surrender to the chaos that gripped the cabin. Her silence began to spread. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it calmed those nearest to her. The woman beside her, who moments earlier had been shaking uncontrollably, now sat a little straighter, drawing strength from the steadiness at her side. A man across the aisle unclenched his fists, watching her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Even the flight attendants, bracing themselves between seats, seemed to draw a fragment of composure from the unspoken strength radiating from seat 12B. The commander's voice returned, firm and commanding, reminding passengers of safety, but also acknowledging her presence once again. It was as if he knew that invoking her name was enough to anchor the entire cabin. Fear still lingered. It could not be erased entirely, but it no longer controlled every breath. Something stronger was beginning to take root. For many, courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to move through it. And as the minutes dragged on, that truth became visible in the cabin. The presence of the woman, revealed through the commander's words and confirmed in her steady posture, transformed the atmosphere. Passengers who had once been gripped by panic now began to find focus. They fastened belts more tightly, adjusted their breathing, and resisted the urge to give in to despair. Their eyes continued to return to her, drawn by something intangible, something that reminded them of resilience in its purest form. The turbulence showed no mercy, battering the aircraft with waves of invisible force, yet the cabin no longer fractured under it. Fear remained, but courage now threaded through it, binding strangers together in a silent pact of survival. And at the heart of it sat the woman who, moments earlier, had been nothing more than a passenger, her strength becoming the measure by which everyone else began to face the storm. The silence that followed the announcement was heavier than the roar of the engines. Every passenger sat suspended between disbelief and unease, their gazes locked on the young woman who, moments ago, had been invisible. Her name, spoken with such authority by the flight commander, altered the very atmosphere of the cabin. It was not merely a name. It was a recognition, a declaration that carried weight far beyond the rows of seats and the narrow aisle. In that moment, the passengers realized they were not looking at just another traveler. They were looking at someone whose presence carried meaning, someone whose identity was inseparable from leadership. Leadership does not always come in uniforms, nor does it always announce itself in obvious ways. It emerges in the stillness before chaos, in the steadiness that anchors others when fear threatens to consume them. As the turbulence shook the aircraft, passengers instinctively sought direction, an anchor to hold on to. The commander's voice provided some reassurance, but the true shift occurred when he named her, pulling her out of anonymity, and placing her firmly at the center of the cabin's fragile balance. His words were not simply a reminder of who she was. They were an acknowledgement that her presence mattered, that she had the ability to guide and influence, even in silence. The recognition was subtle at first. A soldier in the back row straightened his posture, his eyes narrowing in sharp awareness. A flight attendant, bracing herself against a swaying cart, paused just long enough to glance at the woman with something close to respect. A businessman who had been fumbling with his laptop closed it quietly, as though realizing the triviality of his distraction. Leadership had been named, and its effect was immediate. The cabin was no longer a collection of isolated individuals clinging to their own fears. It had become a space charged with expectation, bound together by the weight of her presence. Passengers whispered to one another, some uncertain, some curious, others convinced that they were witnessing the unveiling of someone extraordinary. No one questioned the commander's decision to speak her name. It was clear that his tone carried no frivolity. He had announced her for a reason, and that reason was written in the quiet confidence she carried in her stillness. She had not moved, had not spoken, yet her composure radiated something that words could not manufacture. It was the kind of authority that did not need explanation, the kind that was felt rather than described. As the plane lurched once more, trays clattering and seatbelts straining against sudden weight, the passengers' eyes turned to her again. It was instinctive, unconscious even, the way people look to a figure of stability when the world feels like it is falling apart. Her lack of fear became their shield, her calm their compass. Without speaking, she became the reference point by which others measured their own reactions. Leadership had found its stage, not through command or orders, but through presence alone. The commander's voice returned, steady but urgent, issuing instructions that the crew carried out with precision. Yet even his authority seemed tied now to the recognition he had given her. By naming her, he had redirected the attention of every person on board, reminding them that strength was not absent in this cabin. It was seated among them. It was not an abstract promise of safety, but a tangible reality they could see and feel in the woman who had become the focal point of their survival. Parents calmed their children with renewed determination, pointing to her as though to say that everything would be fine. Soldiers, though trained for discipline, found themselves reassured in ways their training alone could not provide. Even the most skeptical passengers, those who clung stubbornly to disbelief, could not ignore the gravity of what had shifted in the atmosphere. She had been announced, and the recognition had elevated her from anonymity to responsibility in the eyes of everyone aboard. Leadership in that cabin was no longer a question of who held the controls in the cockpit. It was about who could hold the hearts and minds of those in the seats, who could transform fear into something steadier, something bearable. And in that moment, all recognition pointed toward the woman in 12B, the passenger who was never truly just a passenger. Her identity, spoken aloud, had become the catalyst for resilience, a reminder that leadership is not confined to rank or position, but to the unshakable presence of someone who inspires belief even when words are scarce. The intercom had fallen silent again, but its echo lingered in the minds of everyone on board. The commander's voice had not only named her, it had shifted the direction of the entire flight. For passengers who had boarded believing this was a routine journey through the night sky, reality was now altered. They were no longer seated next to strangers on an ordinary plane. They were seated alongside someone whose presence, once hidden, had become impossible to ignore. One name spoken aloud had the power to change everything, and that realization settled over the cabin like a tide that could not be reversed. The soldiers in the back row felt it first, their training alerting them to the significance of what had just happened. They exchanged glances, small nods, unspoken acknowledgments that authority had entered the space in a new form. The businessman in the aisle, who had earlier been buried in numbers and contracts, sat frozen now, his pen idle against the page, his focus locked on the woman in 12B. Even the children sensed the shift, quieting as their parents' whispered questions filled the air. No one could return to the rhythm of distraction. No one could look at her the same way again. The turbulence still rocked the plane, each jolt sending ripples of panic through the rows. But that panic no longer stood alone. It was layered now with expectation, curiosity, and a strange form of hope. People who had clutched their armrests moments earlier were now stealing glances toward her, as if waiting for her next move. Her silence had become louder than any scream. It was a silence filled with purpose, the kind that suggested she knew more than the rest, that she carried something unspoken but vital. The commander had not offered details, only her name, but the way he said it was enough. It had not been casual, nor routine, but deliberate, as though he was reminding the cabin of who she was and why she mattered. The choice to name her was a signal, one that passengers understood instinctively even if they could not articulate it. She was not random, not insignificant, and certainly not powerless. She was, in some way they could all feel, central to what happened next. Conversations broke out in hurried whispers. Some passengers tried to recall news reports, military briefings, or stories they had half heard. Others speculated aloud, wondering what someone like her was doing among them, why she had chosen anonymity until forced into recognition. Each theory only deepened the mystery, and with each unanswered question, the cabin's collective focus tightened around her. She had become the axis on which the flight now turned. The crew, though busy with their duties, stole glances too, their professional composure betraying hints of awe. They carried out the commander's instructions with renewed energy, as though his acknowledgement of her had reaffirmed their own sense of purpose. Even their movements seemed sharper, quicker, more precise. They were no longer simply serving passengers. They were part of a flight that carried significance far beyond what they had expected. For the woman herself, little appeared to change. She remained steady, her face unreadable, her body language restrained. Yet that stillness now carried new meaning. Passengers who had once overlooked her now searched her expression for clues, trying to glimpse reassurance or direction. Every movement, however small, was magnified. A glance, a shift in her seat, even the calm placement of her hands. All were studied with the intensity usually reserved for leaders in the midst of crisis. One name had redrawn the boundaries of perception. Before it was spoken, she had been invisible. After it, she had become essential. The flight, once defined by anonymity and routine, was now marked by awareness and expectancy. The turbulence had not ceased, but the fear it inspired was tempered by the knowledge that someone among them was more than they had assumed. The cabin had been transformed, its atmosphere charged not by the shaking of the plane, but by the realization that the ordinary had given way to the extraordinary. Every passenger carried that realization differently, some with awe, some with unease, others with quiet gratitude, but all of them carried it nonetheless. The commander's words had ensured there was no return to ignorance. Her name had been spoken, and in being spoken, it had altered the course of the night.